Osamu Dazai finished this novel, submitted it for serialization, and then walked into a river with his mistress and drowned. On purpose, just days later. This is No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai, one of the best-selling books in Japanese history. A book so bleak, it's basically a suicide note with a plot. Today, I'm going to argue that everybody who says that this main character is a terrible person is missing the entire point of this book. Stick around because at the end of this video, you're going to understand why an entire generation of Japanese people saw themselves in a man that said he no longer qualifies as human. Quick context before we jump in, because I think this book doesn't make sense without it. Osamu Dazai was born into a wealthy Japanese family in 1909. He spent his entire life trying to destroy that inheritance. Multiple suicide attempts starting in his early 20s, failed relationships, failed marriages, expulsion from university, and ultimately a drug addiction. And No Longer Human, published in 1948, is widely considered his most autobiographical work. Not a memoir, a novel, but close enough that when you're reading it, you're basically watching a man do his own psychological autopsy just months before his death. That's not a metaphor, by the way. Osamu Dazai finished this book and completed his 5th and final suicide attempt shortly after finishing this book. So keep that in mind while we go through this. This isn't a guy that's writing about despair from a safe distance away. No, he's writing while inside of it. Okay, so quick synopsis of the book. I'll keep this spoiler light for anybody who hasn't read this book yet, but stick around for the back half of this video because that's where things I think get very interesting. The novel follows Yozo Oba through 3 notebooks he leaves behind. From early childhood, Yozo says that he has never really understood what makes people act the way they do, what motivates them, how to relate to them. So instead of actually connecting with people, he creates a mask. He becomes a clown. Because for him, hiding behind this comic incompetence allows him to keep people at a safe distance so they won't see him for who he truly is. And that mask works for a while. But in the book, we see Yozo begin to spiral. Drug addiction, alcoholism, eventually that drug addiction to painkillers leads to addiction to morphine, several failed relationships with women that are trying to save him but get hurt in the process, and a suicide attempt that winds up getting the woman that tried to attempt to commit suicide with him killed. He eventually loses and erodes away every relationship that he has, and any institutional foothold he might have is gone. Until the very end of the book, he's institutionalized. In his own words, he becomes disqualified from being human himself, hence the name of the book. The book is not plot driven, it's a descent, and that descent is the point of the book. All right, here's where I want to spend most of this video, because if you've ever gone and read reviews about this book, you'll see over and over again, people say things like, Yozo is a terrible person, or I can't get past how terrible the main character is. And I understand where that sentiment comes from. I mean, look, over the course of the book, Yozo drinks himself into ruin repeatedly, becomes addicted to morphine, leans on women emotionally and financially without giving really anything back to them, is present for and arguably responsible for pulling a woman into a suicide attempt that she does not survive. He essentially abandons every responsibility that comes his way, right? These are real people. This is real damage. I'm not going to sit here and try to tell you otherwise. But here's where I want to push back on the terrible person sentiment. And this is the argument I want you to walk away from this video with. Terrible person implies intent, or at the very minimum, indifference to other people's welfare because you have decided that what you want matters more. That's what makes a villain, in the classic sense, the villain. They have decided and know the cost of what they want, but they impose it anyway. Yozo isn't that. Yozo is entirely almost totally passive. He doesn't scheme, he doesn't manipulate people to get what he wants, because throughout the course of the book, what he seems to want most of the time is to not be seen. He isn't fundamentally equipped psychologically, maybe even neurologically, to set boundaries, to say no. And by his own description of himself several times throughout the book, he functionally is a human being that cannot bear any weight or responsibility of any kind. That's a totally different category of harmful than terrible person. What that is tragic. I think that the Yozo is a terrible person opinion is doing something very deliberate. It is judging Yozo based off of outcomes. Someone died, people were harmed around him, without really reflecting on the 100 pages of interiority that Dazai intentionally gave us to explain why. Like, if you read this book as a plot about a man that hurts women, you will hate Dazai. If you read this book like a psychological study about a man that is so disconnected from the people around him, right? He spends the entire book, his whole goal in life is to not be seen or viewed by people around him. He doesn't want them to get so close. If you read it from that psychological case study perspective, the harm reads differently. It's not excused, right? It's not made as an excuse as to why he treats people like this. It's still unexcusable, but it is explained. I think Dazai's entire authorial project here is to make you sit in this discomfort, to not be able to fully condemn Yozo, but not fully able to forgive him either. I think that tension is what this book is. And I would argue that anybody who comes out of this book with a clean verdict on Yozo has done something and resolved something that Dazai intentionally left unresolved from the start. Okay, now this is where, for me, the setting and time frame of this book gets really interesting. And it's a part of this book and story and Dazai's own life that I think reviewers don't spend enough time focusing on. Because do you remember at the start of this, we said that this book is semi-autobiographical. So the natural question is, how much of Yozo's psychological state is actually Osamu Dazai's psychological state? And how much of that is shaped by what was happening in Japan during the time of Dazai's life and while he was writing this book? And I think the answer is a lot, but maybe in a more complicated way than you would think at first. Let's think about Osamu Dazai's entire life. He was born in 1909, died in 1948 at the age of, gosh, my math is terrible. He would have been 38. So that means that his 20s, 30s, right up into the death at the age of 38, that whole lifespan ran through Japan's turn to militarism. So the invasion of China, World War II, and the collapse of society in Japan after the defeat in that war. His own house was firebombed not once but twice. The March 1945 firebombing raid, that is considered one of the most deadly firebombing raids that occurred in human history, I still think, to this point, let alone Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which he was in the country for. And so you start to get this picture of heavy doom and gloom. Like, try to put yourself in the shoes of a person that is witnessing all of these horrific events as a civilian. Now, an important distinction. Dazai's first suicide attempt happened in 1929, and his addiction issues trace back to the 1930s, the early 1930s. So a lot of that predates the worst of the conflicts that occurred in Japan during that time. So the war didn't create the despair that's in this book, but it certainly compounded it. I mean, imagine having Dazai's psychological fragility and then adding on top of that the years of starvation, displacement, the firebombing, and a total collapse of Japan's societal self-image. It doesn't paint a pretty picture, right? So here's the part of No Longer Human that I find to be totally fascinating. No Longer Human was written in 1948. This is right in the middle of the post-war occupation that Japan was in. It wasn't just physically rebuilding, it was mentally and psychologically rebuilding as well. Japan's emperor had just renounced his own divinity, and all of these Japanese people were asking themselves this question: who are we now? If everything that we were told about ourselves, this Japanese mythology that we completely structured our whole lives around during the war, turned out to be a total performance, who are we? Does this sound familiar? That's Yozo's entire story arc. A man who performs a mask because he's worried that what is underneath that mask is completely unacceptable. Written by a man that is living in a society that has just been forced to drop that mask and is now contending with the reality of what their actual identity is. Dazai belonged to a literary movement called the Decadent School. These were writers who responded to state-forced conformity to patriotism during the war. They responded to this by leaning hard into self-destruction, irony, disillusion in their art forms. It was like a rebellion of the years of conformity. It was a rebellion to this idea that art must serve some state-run idea or model a virtue that the state could utilize. They said, no, we're done doing that. We're going to write about what's underneath us. And it's not heroic and it's not pretty, but look and see what is going on in us. So when you read Yozo's disconnection, right? Like Yozo is trying to perform normality with other humans around him without actually feeling it. I don't think it's a stretch to say that this is both Osamu Dazai's psychological state, but it's also indicative of a national mood that was occurring at the time. This idea is being narrated by a man who never really felt like he had a story to begin with, in a society that had just recently had its identity ripped away. Osamu Dazai finished this book's manuscript, and several weeks later, he was dead. His fifth and final suicide attempt was successful. So this book isn't just semi-autobiographical. It's close to his last final thing that he had to say about his life as a whole. Okay, so let's close the loop on the question I started with. Is Yozo a bad person, a terrible person? I don't think that's the right question, and I don't think Dazai wanted that to be the right question. Look, Yozo does terrible things. I'm not walking that back 100%. But Dazai gave us a portrait of total disconnection written by a man that was feeling all of that disconnection within a society that was also asking themselves who they really were without the mask. Calling him terrible flattens a book that is trying to do something much harder. It's trying to make you feel sympathy and discomfort at the exact same time without letting either one win. Okay, so this was a long one. It's a very heavy subject matter, so I do apologize. I wasn't intending, when I set out to release these last, 3 or 4 videos, I wasn't intending to talk about death and despair so much, but that's just the way the cookie crumbles sometimes, so my bad if this has all bummed you out. Would I recommend this book, No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai? I would say yes. I found it a thoroughly fascinating read. I didn't feel sad when I was reading the book, although I thought that it was a tragic story and kind of an insight into what anxiety and depression and alienation from those around you can look like. The one of the opening lines in the book is, I have lived a life of much shame. I mean, my God, right away I read that and I was like, gosh, this poor guy, right? Like, I wish I could go give him a hug or do something to help him. But I think what Osamu Dazai did here was brilliant. He is giving people a window into what these emotional states can feel like. And so I would recommend this book to anybody. I think it's important for all of us to know and understand what, to the extremes, depression and anxiety can look like. Be forewarned, it's a heavy read, but you can do it. I have faith in you. Look, I love this book. I know a lot of people, do not like this main character and they make this claim that he's a terrible person. I've laid out why I don't think that's the case. If you think that he's a terrible person, put it in the comment section. Tell me what you think. I would love to know your thoughts if you've read the book, of course. Ultimately, though, I would recommend it to everybody. Until next time, this has been Mark from Mark Reads Good. I miss you and I love you. You take care.